Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I know that you've heard several lectures on institutions already, so hopefully I can differentiate. And just to kind of foreshadow, the way I hope to differentiate is to focus on one kind of outcome. I don't know if you want to call it an institution or not, but an outcome of certain institutional arrangements, which is what we call spontaneous order. So that's where I'm kind of going towards. And by the end of the lecture, hopefully you have a good grasp of what spontaneous order entails, what the characteristics are, and then I'll give you an example of spontaneous order, which is the market process. So some things I'm going to go through faster than others. If you have any questions after on things you don't catch, you can come up, or if you want to email me after you get home or whatever, I'll gladly send you my slides as well, because I know we have limited time. So first, in order to understand this, we need to understand the fundamental issue that we are concerned about with society, which is social cooperation and order in the broadest sense. Here's the thing. In order to progress, society or civilization needs cooperation. You need, in order to cooperate with other people. This is very straightforward. Michael Thomas will be giving a whole talk on the division of labor later on. And the idea is that, just to kind of provide a common sense understanding, you can do a lot more interacting with people than you can if you produce everything yourself. That's the core idea behind it. The thing is, if you think about it, most people take order that exists in the world for granted. They point out the failures. They point out things like Enron collapsing, or the financial crisis of 2008, or other issues, whatever it is, unemployment, whatever it is that they want to focus on. And they act as if the world is terrible, all these things are going wrong. But what they oftentimes neglect is the broad order that is around us that is generating beneficial things. So when we talk about economics, and I would actually argue social science more broadly, these are the type of questions that we're concerned about. And if you think about it, a lot of the talks you've been hearing and a lot of the talks you will hear have really been addressing these questions from different perspectives. So, how do economic systems work when they're functioning properly, the way we want them to function? By the way we want them to function, I mean they are generating desirable outcomes from the perspective of the participants in the system, you and I and others. What mechanisms of social cooperation exist such that we can get things that we value, and other people can as well? How do these mechanisms emerge, and what are the threats to them? What risks exist that undermine the mechanisms that generate cooperation and progress in society? That's really what we're concerned about. If you're concerned about either prosperity in the United States or prosperity in other societies, fundamentally you're concerned with these types of questions. So here's the thing. There's two types of order. I call them type 1 and type 2. And they're really straightforward. And they're not mutually exclusive. They're actually related to each other. Type 1 coordination is when you interact with other people. Think about it in terms of meeting someone for lunch. You know if the person's there or not because you show up at a certain time and place and they're either there or they're not. If they're there, you have coordinated with them. Two individuals have coordinated and they are working together to achieve some end. In my example, eating lunch together. Things like picking a side of the road to drive on is another example of this. In game theory talk, this is what we call a coordination game. People need to coordinate their actions in order to receive a higher payoff. If people are driving on different sides of the road, you're going to have a problem. If you show up for lunch but your friend doesn't, you're going to have a problem. Discoordination. This type of coordination is evident from the actor's point of view. In other words, the people that are directly involved know whether they are coordinating with others or not. Type 2 is broader. It's really spontaneous order. So it's broader than type 1 coordination. And it is actually a result of type 1 coordination, of millions and millions of different people interacting to achieve their own ends. The idea behind spontaneous order or undesigned order is that interactions between people generate a broader order beyond their actions, a broader order beyond what they're even aware of. So while type 1 coordination, think again about getting lunch, is completely evident to the individuals involved, type 2 coordination is not. Most of the time, individuals are completely unaware that they are contributing to a broader order, and even if they were aware, they would not be able to understand it. I know this is somewhat abstract at this point, but it's going to become more concrete as we go throughout. So type 1 and type 2, this is what I'm going to focus on, type 2 coordination, for the rest of the talk. Hayek, in his last book, The Fatal Conceit, gets at this exact point. To understand civilization, we must appreciate what he called the extended order, that's a spontaneous order, resulted not from human design or intention, but spontaneously. It arose from conforming to certain traditional and moral practices whose significance people failed to understand and they cannot prove. All this means, if you think about it, is in your own life, just think about your own life. during a daily set of actions that you take. You follow a set of rules, of norms, which aren't written down. No one enforces them upon you, but you follow them anyway. You might call them manners. You might call them norms of trust. You might call them belief systems, culture. Doesn't matter. You can call it whatever you like. Nonetheless, cooperation takes place absent some set of listed instructions and absent someone standing behind you with a gun enforcing every action you take. It's not that no disorder ever happens, by the way. It's not that no crime ever happens. Of course it does. It is that there is a widespread cooperation that takes place which people don't understand. That's going to be important, and I'll explain why. So this notion of institutions. When we talk about institutions, we're talking about the formal and informal rules of the game. The reason this is important for what I want to get at is that institutions facilitate or discourage order. Think about this. If there are institutions in place which protect you, your person, and your property, that is going to encourage a certain type of behavior. You can trade with other individuals, for instance, because you know that your property is secure. If, in stark contrast, institutions are lacking, by that I mean, in my example, there are no property rights or weakly enforced property rights. It's not that no interaction will happen, but it will raise the cost of interacting with other people precisely because you cannot be confident that your person and property is going to be protected. Institutions, from an economic standpoint, are important precisely because they are prices. They raise the cost of engaging in certain behaviors or not engaging in them. What we want is what? Going back to the first slide, social cooperation. Therefore, what ultimately matters are institutional arrangements which raise the net benefit of engaging in social cooperation with other people. And if you think about the societies that are wealthy, relatively wealthy, they tend to have institutions which encourage social cooperation relative to those that are poor. And in those societies, social cooperation is discouraged. We'll come back to this later in my third talk when we talk about foreign aid, because that's going to matter. So let's focus on order. There's two types. We can have people plan order. That's what this is. You all sitting in front of me is a planned order. Someone sat down and said, we're going to have a seminar at these times. They invited you. Human reason coordinated activities, and it worked quite well. We're all here at the same time talking about these things. So these things are not mutually exclusive. But what I want to focus on is the second one, unplanned, undesigned, or what we call spontaneous order. And these are emergent in nature. They are unplanned. Hayek's quote, the one that I put up a few moments ago, is basically saying that unplanned orders are very broad, the extended order of society, and that planned orders are embedded within the extended order. And this is going to matter later in my next lecture when we talk about institutional change, because what we can plan is going to be constrained by the extended order. What we can do to society, impose upon society, is going to be constrained by what traditions, beliefs, cultural values, and so on exist. Spontaneous order. A lot of people tend to associate this, a lot of people who aren't in the know, tend to associate this, the spontaneous order no, but you guys are in the spontaneous order no after this, is associated with libertarianism or Hayek. That is wrong. And the reason it is wrong is because the concept of spontaneous order has a very rich history, which actually goes back well before the 18th century, but I'm going to start here with the Scottish Enlightenment because I view the Scottish Enlightenment as kind of the key part where, or the key episode where the notion of spontaneous order kind of took hold, and we're limited in time, so I can't spend too much time going back. David Hume emphasized the importance of emergent conventions in coordinating people's activities. He has the famous example of rowers in a boat who need to coordinate paddling in order to get anywhere. Right? If they are discoordinated, the boat's going to be going around in a circle. So they have to figure out how to coordinate their actions. And he talks about how conventions emerge among people in order to facilitate social cooperation. Adam Smith, of course, is known for the invisible hand postulate. Really what this entails is people in the marketplace coordinating their activities, pursuing their own interests, their own ends, if you will, and in doing so, generating broader cooperation. Adam Ferguson, in his essay on history of civil society, I won't read all this to you, but basically it says, look, society's not planned, and here's the main takeaway. The order that occurs is the result of human action, but not the execution of human design. This is the standard definition of spontaneous order that many people give. When Hayek's talking about spontaneous order, he oftentimes cites Hume and Smith, but he also cites Ferguson a lot. So if you hear about Adam Ferguson now in the context of this, you understand why. So spontaneous order is the result of human action, but not the execution of human design. So it's purposeful action, but not planned. Remember, we made the distinction between emergent orders and planned orders, okay? And so that's what Ferguson's getting at. The power of spontaneous order thinking or emergent order thinking was that for the first time, what the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment did was come up with a systematic framework for understanding complex phenomena. Not just economic phenomena, but phenomena in life in general, which are what today we call complex systems. They are beyond the grasp of human reason. They are the result of interrelated units or elements, by that I mean humans, who generate a very broad and extended order. That's what they were getting at, and they were really the first people to systematically do that. And not just to kind of come up with the concept and define it, but also apply it to a whole variety of different social orderings. So Hume, for instance, talks about government, promises, property rights. Smith talks about, of course, the marketplace and how people cooperate and coordinate. So they're covering a whole bunch of different contexts, not just economics, but social, legal, and political as well, and how these concepts apply. Pongrasic gave a talk on what is Austrian economics, correct? Okay. So I'm sure he touched upon the fact that Karl Menger is considered the founder or father of Austrian economics. And he was pretty explicit in pointing out the importance of what today we call spontaneous order. He called it organic institutions. But the question he asked is, how is it which institutions that serve the common welfare come into being with no one planning them? That's really saying the central question of the social sciences is, how do spontaneous orders emerge? That's really what Menger's asking here. That's what he's getting at. Those who followed in Menger's footsteps, Mises, Hayek, Kerzner, Rothbard, all touched upon this concept in different ways. Some were more explicit about it. So again, the notion of spontaneous order is oftentimes associated explicitly with Hayek. But all these scholars got at, or were trying to get at, the fundamental issues of social cooperation and the mechanisms which facilitate it. And how far can we extend that logic? So here are the 6 characteristics of spontaneous order. The first 2 I already covered in Ferguson's definition. The reason I kind of moved a little quickly through that is because I knew I'd spend a little more time on it here. The first is that spontaneous order is the result of human action. Now, here's confusion that a lot of people have when it comes to spontaneous order. They say, okay, you're just saying people do stuff and then good stuff emerges. And that's not what the concept is getting at. Here's what's happening. Each individual pursues their ends, whatever those are, to the best of their ability. In other words, they utilize the means that they know, that they think are the best to achieve their end. And all of us do that. This makes no judgment about the quality or ethical quality of the ends. We take those as given. All the claim here is that people pursue their ends to the best of their ability. That means each of us is doing stuff. That's all it means. It's not random behavior. It's not irrational behavior. It's purposeful. We actually take active steps to accomplish our ends. That's number 1. Number 2, they're not planned. So when you or anyone else decide to enter a market and engage in an exchange, what are you doing? You're pursuing your ends. You're saying, I want that good or service, and I'm going to purchase it in order to fulfill my ends. You are not saying, boy, I'm going to go today and buy this bottle of water because I really feel like contributing to the broader social order. I feel like facilitating some social cooperation today. But one of the most powerful insights of economics is that in doing that, in pursuing your own narrow ends, you do contribute to the broader social order, and you don't even have to know you're doing it. That's why earlier when I talked about unplanned orders, I said the actors that are involved in the system are oftentimes unaware that they're even contributing to it. And they don't need to be aware in order for the order to emerge. That's precisely the power of spontaneous order thinking. So, result of human action but not human design. Number 3, they can be described as orders. All this means is we need to have some kind of pattern taking place. Everything is not a spontaneous order. There has to be some kind of interrelation that allows us to make predictions about how the system is operating and how it will operate. What we call pattern predictions, broad predictions as compared to point predictions, which are specific predictions. I don't need to know the exact price of this bottle of water. What I need to know is that if we allow markets to operate, and people want water, water will tend to get to the people that want it. That's a pattern prediction. It's a very broad prediction about how markets operate in that context. So all this is saying is we need to be able to identify interrelationships and a pattern emerging from those relationships. Again, all this is doing in some sense is constraining our definition by limiting spontaneous order to certain patterns rather than saying everything is a spontaneous order. Number 4, they're reinforcing. There has to be feedback mechanisms that reinforce the behavior of the elements that are involved, positive and negative, rewards and punishments. The reason this is important is because we want what? Cooperation and order. But here's the thing. If you're going this way and I'm going this way, we're not cooperating. But we want cooperation and order. That's our goal. Why? Because it generates benefits that you and I value. A well-functioning order system will do what? It will provide feedback so that when we're passing each other, we change our behaviors in the future. We adjust our behaviors so that we can cooperate with each other and both benefit. Absent that, the system will break down because people will just keep passing each other. Desirable benefits will not be generated. Number 5, there's rules of conduct. These rules of conduct can be formal, again, legislated, written down rules, or they can be informal. They can be norms. They can be things like norms of ostracism. If you don't cooperate, if you cheat people, if you're rude to people, they won't interact with you anymore. We don't have a formal law that you need to hold the door for people or you need to shake their hand. Those are norms. If you don't do them, right? If you slam the door in someone's face, if you refuse to shake their hand, oftentimes they will refuse to interact with you in the future. They will ostracize you. Right? It's an informal norm of punishment which incentivizes you to be polite. Number 6, they're abstract. This is the hardest one for most people to grasp. And the reason is because, as I'll come to in my subsequent lectures, there's a natural human tendency to want to control things, to think that someone is in charge of things. And when there's disorder, what's the first thing you hear? We need to control it, to fix it, to guide it. The perhaps most challenging aspect of spontaneous order type thinking is that that's not the case. The notion is one of abstraction. Precisely because you don't need to know that you're part of the order, it can go beyond human reason. What anyone can imagine would actually happen. Again, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself because I'm going to talk about the market process in one moment, and I'll give you a very specific example of this. All right, so abstraction means that it's beyond the grasp of human reason. Spontaneous orders are such that they cannot be grasped. They cannot be understood by the human mind. It's not that you can't understand aspects of it. Of course we can. We can identify order and we can see things happening. We can see patterns happening. The broader point here is that you cannot hope to understand the entire system, all aspects of it. This is going to have implications for policy, of course, because if we can't understand it, that naturally places limits on what we can do to supposedly fix it. So, the market process. This is perhaps the best illustration of spontaneous order type thinking. So after I define it, let me kind of link up the 6 characteristics with the market and show you how the market fulfills those 6 characteristics. And it will kind of illustrate what I was just talking about. Here's what the market process is. You want stuff, I want stuff. Oftentimes, those ends are different. But as we discussed, we need each other to achieve our ends. We need to cooperate. How is it that people cooperate given dispersed knowledge that we know different things and different expectations? In other words, people are human. They don't have perfect information. There's uncertainty in the world. How is it that we coordinate and cooperate under those conditions? The theory of the market process is the theory of how people go about figuring out how to cooperate with others and adjust their behavior when they make mistakes. That's fundamentally what the theory of the market process is all about. What are the characteristics of the market? Well, as I mentioned, markets are the result of people acting. I want things and I need your cooperation to get it. So I interact with you. That fulfills characteristic 1. Number 2, they're not designed. No one sits down and says at the beginning of a quarter or of a year, oh, we're going to need this many bottles of water or this many pens or paper, right? Or there's no central planner that says the next great invention is going to be the iPad. Instead, what we have is a dispersed series of entrepreneurial actions, many of which you never observe. And again, the powerful aspect of Marx is you don't have to observe them. Yet things you value and want tend to get to you. Markets cannot be designed and planned. This, of course, is the great insight from the calculation debate, the debate over socialism versus calculism that Pengrasic was talking with you about yesterday or the day before. Number 3, markets can be described as orders. Again, I can't make a point prediction about what the price of water will be next year. Economics does not allow me to do that. But it does allow me to make pattern predictions about how markets work. I know that a well-functioning market is one where resources will tend to be allocated to their highest valued use. How do I know that? Well, we have a theory of how prices operate and what prices capture, which is opportunity cost, and how people will change their behavior when prices adjust. A price increases, you consume less of a good or service and vice versa. That allows me to make pattern predictions about how markets operate. Prices will tend to correspond to the opportunity cost, and resources tend to be allocated to their highest valued use. Tend being the key word, because errors are made all the time, because we're human, and that's fine. That's precisely why markets are so powerful. They allow us to be human and allow fallible people to make mistakes, adjust their behavior accordingly, and still achieve the ends that they wish. Number 4, we need positive and negative feedback. Got that. It's called profit and loss. The ands in italics, because a common mistake people make is forgetting the loss part and then blaming markets. That is the housing crisis. What does this mean? Well, if you allow profit, private profit, but you socialize losses, what happens? You incentivize risky behavior. If I say, look, I'm the government, and I am going to let Svet make risky loans to people. And if they work out, he gets to keep all the profit. But if they fail, and Svet's on the risk of going bankrupt, I am going to require all of you to just be humanitarians, care about your fellow man, reach into your wallets, take some money out and give it to Svet to help him offset his losses. Because we can't have him go out of business. That would just be terrible. What have you done? Well, economics, based on pattern predictions, would say what? All else constant, Svet will tend to take on riskier investments. Because if he wins, if they work out, he gets the upside, the profit. If he loses, we spread the loss among lots of people. So you have distorted the feedback mechanism that distorts how markets operate. Markets are fundamentally one of profit and loss. Always remember that. When people oftentimes rail against markets, if you look at what's really happening, something funky is happening to one of these two things. When markets don't operate, there's either poorly defined property rights, profit and loss is being screwed up. Notice, by the way, of course, that in order to have profit and loss, you have to have prices. Profit and loss is the differential between prices. You buy something for a price, you combine it with other stuff, oftentimes, and you sell it for a price. The differential is either the profit or loss. You screw with prices, you indirectly and ultimately screw with profit and loss. So keep that in mind. Most things when you pick up the newspaper and people say this market's not working or this corporation's doing this wrong, first things that should come to your mind, let me think about property rights here. Are people internalizing the full costs and benefits of their behavior? And are profit and loss operating correctly? If they're not, the next step in your analysis then is to think about how the incentives change when profit and loss is not functioning correctly. Rules of conduct. In order for markets to operate, what do you need? Property rights. Why do you need property rights? Well, first, of course, if you don't own something, you can't trade it by definition. So in order to have exchange, you need to have property rights. Second of all, property rights incentivize you to take care of whatever it is that you own. Of course, the other benefit of having exchange is what? Well, exchange of goods or goods and services lead to the emergence of prices, exchange ratios, which then capture opportunity cost, right? Private property generates an incentive to act on the knowledge that is generated by markets. If the price of water goes up, the power of markets is that I don't need to know if the supply side of the market changed or the demand side changed. As an average person, who cares? It's not like I said, other than economists, no one sits there and is like, I wonder if the demand curve shifted or the supply curve shifted. Right? It's like, nope, the price went up. I consume less of it. Right? What is that increase in price communicating? What knowledge? Somewhere in the world, somewhere out there, some things are changing that are influencing the supply or the demand side of the market. and you don't need to know the specifics, but you have an incentive to change your behavior precisely because the price has increased. And one of the core postulates of economics is that people respond to incentives, which all of you do. You raise the price of something, you engage in less of that behavior. Markets facilitate this entire process with no one guiding them. As I mentioned, markets are abstract. You cannot plan the outcomes of markets. Keep this in mind, guys, because what I want to suggest to you to kind of foreshadow is economic development, especially in the post-World War II period, is central planning. There's a poor society over there. We're the enlightened people over here. We have wealth. We are going to take money and give it to them and tell them what to do with it in order to generate development. But if you understand this point, right off the bat, you say, well, how do you know that? How do you know what to produce? How do you know how to allocate resources to their highest valued use outside the context of the market? That's fundamentally the question of economic development, which of course then leads into issues of foreign aid, which we'll be discussing. The, again, marvel of the market is that no one needs to know this or understand it. And also, in some sense, though, it's also the downside of markets. Precisely because they're so powerful and no one needs to know that they're part of this order, it's easy to rail against markets. Not realizing that if people actually undertook a lot of the policies people advocate, it would destroy the very things that generate the wealth that we have. So why does all this matter? And I want to suggest it matters for three reasons. Number one, communicating economics. And I mean communicating economics in the broadest sense. Talking to family and friends. Talking on the internet, blogging, Facebook, whatever it is that the kids are doing these days. Teaching, if you want to become a teacher of economics, or of any social science, I would suggest. The key thing to get across to people is that markets generate order without anyone guiding it. No one needs to be in charge of it. In fact, putting someone in charge is perhaps the most devastating thing you can do to an economic system, because it fundamentally undermines all the self-ordering properties that I just went through. James Buchanan, he won the Nobel Prize in 1986, emphasized that pointing this out, the self-ordering properties of markets, is the most important thing that economists can do. For those of you who have taken economics or will, perhaps your professor or your teacher, depending on what level of school you're at, talked about spontaneous order. But I'm guessing for most of you they didn't. They set up the economic problem, if you will, as an allocation problem. They said, look, we have scarce resources and we need to figure out how to allocate them to their highest valued use, as if that's some kind of problem that can be solved by really smart people. And that's the mentality that permeates a lot of economics. They treat the economic problem, if you will, which is that we face scarcity and we need to figure out how to allocate resources to their highest valued use, as an engineering problem, a technical problem that can be solved using the tools of economics and can be solved by really smart people. It's an engineering type mentality. You will know that you have fully internalized the spontaneous order way of thinking when you hear those things and your first reaction is one of discomfort, one of saying you are fundamentally missing the point. The point is not one of writing down some optimization problem and maximizing some utility function subject to a constraint. It is figuring out the institutional arrangement that allows people to figure out how to cooperate, given that they're imperfect people. Number two, policy. I said that this has strong implications for policy. If you appreciate spontaneous order type thinking, right off the bat, your natural tendency towards policy should be one of real humility. And I don't mean the fake humility that politicians, because everyone says you need to be humble, right? It's like, yep, we need to be humble. Let's fix this system and do that and intervene over there. That's not humility. That's the opposite. That's arrogance, because it is fundamentally the assumption that you are smart enough to fix very complex systems. Spontaneous order thinking says, look, don't be a self-hating human. You're human, I'm human, we make mistakes, we have very limited knowledge. It's not that we don't know anything, but we have a very limited scope of what we can understand about the world. And we should pursue our ends to the best of our abilities and allow others to do the same. And that process of experimentation generates mutually beneficial outcomes. It's not that, the claim is not that markets are perfect, precisely the opposite. Markets are necessary precisely because people are imperfect. If people were perfect, you wouldn't need markets. You wouldn't need the market process. You would know exactly what you wanted. I would know exactly what I wanted. We know all the information in the world and no mistakes would be made. We just interact with each other and the world would be honky-dory. But we know that's not the case. We know mistakes are made constantly. Errors are made. The question is, under what circumstances are those errors minimized? Economics, as a tool, as a way of thinking about the world, with spontaneous order theorizing at its core, is not one of social control. It is not one of saying, look, people are imperfect. I'm a really smart economist because I sat in classes for 4 years and have PhD after my name, so I'm going to fix people. I'm going to fix the world. That is a fundamental abuse of what economics as a discipline is able to do. Now, people do it all the time. Turn on any television program and you'll see economists on there piping out opinions about things that they shouldn't be talking about. Why? Economics doesn't allow them to predict what interest rates are going to do, to predict specific point predictions about the future. And of course, you know this, because if those individuals somehow had access to the economic oracle, why would they be on television? They'd be out buying an island somewhere and sitting on it, because they'd be billionaires. But of course, you get paid very well to spout out overly confident opinions about things. And of course, in order for government to implement policy, what do they need? They need some kind of endorsement and some kind of legitimacy, which comes from people who have PhD after their name. Why? The average citizen, if you talk to them about economics, when I talk to people about economics, and they find out I'm an economics professor, they'll say, I took an economics class, it was really hard, yeah, it's really difficult, I don't understand it. So then they say, yeah, whatever an economist says therefore must be right. Couldn't be more dangerous and untrue. First of all, economics really isn't that hard. It's pretty straightforward once you get down the core principles, and then it's just simply applying those principles consistently across contexts. And part of it is understanding the proper limits of the discipline. That's humility, understanding what you can and cannot say about things, right? And recognizing that and being willing to admit it. Lots of people are unwilling to say, I don't know, when they don't know something. They just spout something off. But when we say, look, what do you think is going to happen about this? I don't know. I don't know how anyone would know that. That's what Hayek's getting at here. The task of economics is to say, look, you can't do that. It all sounds very nice what you're saying. It's very grand, and you might have the best of intentions, and you might want to really help people, but intentions do not equal outcomes. That's what economics is all about, pointing out those limitations. Scholarship. Some of you might want to go into academics. Some of you might want to go into think tanks and engage in scholarship. This then links up with policy, of course, if you want to do scholarship that has policy outcomes. I'm not going to read this all to you. This is from Menger's Methods book again. But look at the first sentence basically up to here. Law, language, the state, money, markets, all these social structure in their various empirical forms are in constant change, to no small extent the unintended result of social development. This goes back to my earlier point. This is not purely an issue of economics proper, meaning just exchange or things where money is involved. All of the various institutional arrangements that you and I take for granted on a daily basis. Law, meaning again, formal law, but also norms, language, government itself, all of these things are largely the result of emergent orders that happened over centuries. And you can't hope to understand the complexity behind this. And that's okay. Recognizing the limits of your knowledge is the first step in making informed, well, basically being informed about how the world works, but number two, being informed about what you can say about policy then. So no matter what your interests are, given that you're at this seminar, I imagine your interest in the broadest sense is one of liberty. And what I want to suggest to you is that liberty is conducive with spontaneous order type thinking, and that those who fail to appreciate spontaneous order type thinking can't appreciate liberty. Because liberty entails notions of ownership over your person and property. It entails experimentation, figuring out what it means to live a good life for yourself, but also figuring out new and better ways of doing things, which indirectly benefit other humans, and coordinating with other people so that you can achieve your ends and that they can achieve theirs. And that's fundamentally what's at the core of spontaneous order type thinking. So again, keep this in mind. For many people, it's abstract and very difficult to grasp because they're used to thinking of things in terms of order. There's either order or there's anarchy. And really what spontaneous order says is no, there's not. You don't need kind of a central hand or central government planning things, and we get lots of order without it. And really, the bigger concern is not just not appreciating it, but policies and various government initiatives that you think are actually helping oftentimes end up undermining spontaneous order and therefore undermine things that we value, freedom and liberty that we are ultimately concerned about. So with that, let me stop and we can talk about whatever it is that you'd like to talk about. Yes?
Would you say there are negative spontaneous orders?
Very good question. The theory of spontaneous order does not make any value judgment about the goodness or badness of the order itself. So we can envision many cases where people might judge a emergent order to be bad. It depends, of course, on your ethical benchmark. Ethics, of course, is outside the scope of economics proper. That is not to say that ethics is unimportant. It's extremely important. Just to say, look, as an economist, I only can make certain claims because it's not my area of expertise. But let's just go back for a moment. We can imagine laws, for instance, emerging in an area that repress certain groups of people. We don't need to imagine it. We can just look around the world, right? There are societies, a large number of societies, that treat groups of people dramatically different. So in many societies, women can't own property. They have no control over their person, right, or property in terms of physical goods. Children have very little control over their kind of person and how they grow up, right? You might make the argument that those are bad spontaneous orders. So that's not at odds with it. Then the issue is, what do you do about it? And that's a much more difficult question. Because if you take Hayek's warning seriously that you can't understand the full array of institutions and your human reason is limited, it should give you caution saying that's bad, therefore we're going to intervene to fix it, to impose, for instance, a new legal system. Because that runs into a host of new issues I'll be talking about in a few moments in the next lecture. But your point's well taken, and that's actually what I would say is one of the gaps in spontaneous order theorizing that needs more work, is how do we differentiate between good and bad, which is really an ethical question. That's step one. And number two, then what do we do about it once we recognize them? Julia.
What's the best way to combat the engineering and central planning notion of how to do economics today?
Sure. Well, it's very difficult precisely for a few reasons. One is that in economics proper, in graduate training, the engineering mentality, the way students are taught, graduate students are taught, tends to be engineering based. The allocation paradigm is the dominant paradigm. Then they go teach students and it kind of perpetuates. So one way to combat that is to teach and emphasize spontaneous order type theorizing for those who want to go into academics. When it comes to communication in the broadest sense, and again, I mean that not just writing op-eds, I mean in your daily life, it's just repeating it and making it clear to people. I don't think that people are fundamentally at odds or have some kind of predisposition against spontaneous order. I think most people don't think about it. Again, the power of markets is that you don't need to think about these things. You don't need to understand it, but it generates good things. The downside of that is it's very easy to critique it, right? So you point out all these failures, and people say, markets fail, the financial crisis, Enron, this, that, and they point out what we call market failures, right? And they're focused on all what they consider the bad stuff, and they neglect all the good stuff, right? Let me give you an example of how to flip that over. Someone might say, well, Enron collapsed. See, capitalism and markets fail. That's one way of viewing it. Here's an alternative way of viewing it. Markets work extremely well. You say, well, wait, I don't understand. All these people lost their pensions and their life savings. And I say, yeah, here is a corporation that was engaged in fraudulent practices with, of course, the help of the United States government, both the SEC as well as other federal agencies who were willing participants in helping them use accounting practices that allowed them to cover up the fact that they were basically bankrupt. And nonetheless, they couldn't beat the market. The market revealed the fraud. Now, it took some time to see through their trickery that they had done in being in cahoots with government. Nonetheless, even in the most favorable case where you would expect a corporation to be able to sustain under conditions of fraud, where it has the backing, either implicitly or explicitly, of government agencies, it still couldn't. So you say, look, that's an example of markets working quite well. markets weeded out the failed business. Housing crisis. Of course people suffered under it. No one denies this. But that's markets working. Resources have been misallocated. Houses were built that shouldn't have been built. The hard part to communicate with all this is the human element. The minute you say, well, yeah, people lost their jobs, people lost their houses, people lost their pensions, but there's a reason why. People don't want to hear that because it's not pleasant to hear. But keep in mind that economics and pointing these things out is not endorsing people losing their pensions or losing their jobs. It's not the argument, right? Which is why kind of people say, well, economists are cold-hearted. Well, maybe, or maybe they like to point out reality, right? Maybe they like to point out that this is actually what happens in the world and we're just trying to understand it to avoid it happening again. So really, people need to communicate this in all areas. We need journalists, we need policymakers, and we need academics, all communicating this kind of core idea and way of thinking. In your own life, you need to exercise your brain. You need to get into your head the spontaneous order way of thinking and to view the world through that lens. The minute you are able to do that, you'll see the world differently if you haven't already. Because you'll look around and you'll walk around everywhere you go and you'll be like, oh my gosh, look at this order. Right? It's not that there's complete order, but it's also not chaos. People aren't fighting with each other. People aren't beating each other up randomly. You know that you can go into a store and pick someone's property up and look at it like this, but you don't go into someone's house and do it. Right? You don't walk into someone's house and, what are you doing? I'm doing the same thing I just did at Target. I'm looking at your product. That's my stuff. Get out of my house. Right? People do these things. There's order everywhere. You drive on the road. There's car accidents every once in a while, but there's lots of merging traffic that doesn't generate car accidents. And there's no one standing there saying, you go now, and so on. And somehow people coordinate. That's the order I'm talking about. Every time you walk into a store and purchase something, that's the order I'm talking about. And until you internalize it, you can't communicate it to others. But really, when you do, you should get really jazzed up. Because the division of labor, the fact that we were able to figure out how to cooperate with other people, the stuff that Hume, that Smith, that Ferguson was talking about, is really, in some sense, a period in mankind where you had a dramatic increase in standards of living, precisely as Michael will talk about because of the division of labor. So that's what's going on, and that's really what it takes, is a full frontal attack from all sides, just appreciating the world around you and communicating it to people. Yeah?
Yeah, and within that, sir, like, you just mentioned Enron and then other things where government is involved, but then it creates this thing like, well, now government has to come to the rescue for its own problem that it had. Is there some sort of simple rhetoric we can tell people, like, listen, this was caused by government, now you expect them to fix it, like bailouts and the like?
There's no simple rhetoric, I don't think, because the economics, to the extent economics is complicated, it is because you trace a chain of consequences. You can't just do one thing. If you do A, it has B, C, and D as consequences. And the power of economics is it helps us trace out that chain of consequences. The best we can do, I think, and others might disagree, so this is my opinion, is point that out to people, right? And to continually point it out. So for instance, the too big to fail logic. The standard type logic is, well, we can't let it collapse. Well, maybe, but one of the things as economists, our job is to point out what we call the moral hazard problem. You have just incentivized people now to engage in risky behavior and to become bigger, right? Because you know they'll get bailed out. This was what I was trying to get at with my example with Svet, bailing Svet out. It's the too big to fail type argument. And ultimately, that's the best we got. It's just straight up communicating economics to people in a straightforward way. From personal experience, it's a frustrating process because they either won't appreciate it or, again, say, well, that's nice in theory, but we need to help people, right? And so that's the battle we face. And what can we do other than continue to repeat it to the best of our abilities? Thank you very much.